Welcome to Underworld UK, where Britain's darkest stories are brought to light. From the gritty streets of gangland London, Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham, from Curtis Warren to the Cray twins to county lines and modern-day true crime, we cover everything. Bringing you new videos every week. Subscribe so that you'll be notified when the next video is put out.
In the summer of 2019, 6 bullets ripped through a quiet family home in one of London's most affluent suburbs. It was a kind of place where violent crime felt distant, manicured lawns, high fences, private security. But that illusion was shattered in seconds. The man they hit didn't die, but his life was effectively over. Paralysed from the chest down, confined to a wheelchair, and left fighting for survival. At the centre of the plot was a name already whispered across Europe's criminal underworld: Daniel Kelly, a man linked to museum heists, drug trafficking, armed robberies and international organised crime. This was not a random act of violence, it was a professional hit that had been planned months in advance. On the evening of 11th July 2019, former cage fighter Paul Allen was standing in the kitchen of his rented home in Woodford Green, East London. He'd been released from prison just 3 years earlier after serving time for one of the most notorious crimes in British history. That evening he was at home with his partner and children, believing he had finally found a safe place to rebuild his life. Then, without warning, gunshots shattered the silence. 6 bullets were fired through the glass conservatory at the rear of the house. One severed Allen's finger, another tore through his throat before becoming lodged in his spinal cord. He collapsed to the floor, struggling to breathe and bleeding heavily. His partner, Jade Bovington, screamed as she called the emergency services, while neighbours and a private security guard ran toward the house. Within moments, the attacker had fled, vaulting a low wall and disappearing into a waiting vehicle. The entire attack lasted seconds, but the consequences would last a lifetime. Paul Allen survived, but doctors quickly made it clear the damage was catastrophic. He was paralysed from the chest down, his injuries described as life-threatening. He would never walk again. For detectives, the precision of the shooting was immediately alarming. This was not an impulsive attack or a robbery gone wrong. It was a targeted assassination attempt, carried out with military-style efficiency in a quiet residential street. Allen was no ordinary victim. In 2006, he was one of the ringleaders behind what remains Britain's biggest ever armed robbery, the £54 million Securitas depot heist in Tonebridge, Kent. Armed men wearing balaclavas stormed the cash depot, threatening staff with guns, including an AK-47. They escaped with tens of millions of pounds in Bank of England notes, abandoning a further £154 million that would not fit into their lorry. The robbery sent shockwaves through the country and remains one of the most audacious crimes in UK history. Allen fled to Morocco just days after the robbery, but was later arrested in Rabat alongside fellow robber Lee Murray. He was extradited back to the UK and sentenced to 18 years in prison. After serving his time, Allen was released in 2016, but freedom did not bring peace. In September 2018, a gunman opened fire at Allen and his pregnant daughter in the doorway of their home in Woolwich. Both survived, but the message was clear: Allen was still a marked man. Fearing for his family's safety, Allen relocated to Woodford Green, renting a large detached property in what he believed was a safer area. For a time, it seemed the threat had passed, but in July 2019, the violence caught up with him once again. As detectives began piecing together the evidence, their attention turned to 3 men, Daniel Kelly and brothers Louis and Stewart Ahearne. All 3 were already known to law enforcement, not just in the UK, but across Europe. Their criminal activities were sophisticated, organised and international in scope. Just 1 month before the shooting, Kelly and the Ahearne brothers had carried out a high-value burglary at the Museum of Far Eastern Arts in Geneva, Switzerland. Disguised as tourists, they smashed display cases and escaped with more than £2.7 million worth of Ming Dynasty antiques. The theft stunned Swiss authorities and immediately attracted international attention. The Ahearne brothers were later jailed in Switzerland for the museum heist, but the full picture of their activities was far bigger than a single burglary. Back in the UK, Kelly and the Ahearnes had also been linked to a series of burglaries in affluent areas where they posed as police officers to gain access to gated communities. They used fake uniforms, counterfeit identification, and even blue flashing lights mounted to the vehicle. Once inside, they targeted high-value properties, stealing cash, jewellery and designer goods. These were not opportunistic criminals. They planned meticulously and operated with confidence. But the shooting of Paul Allen represented a major escalation. According to prosecutors, the attack was the result of weeks of planning. Surveillance had been carried out on Allen's movements, vehicles were tracked, burner phones were used to avoid detection, routes were mapped, and escape plans rehearsed. Evidence was carefully disposed of. This was not the work of low-level criminals. It was organised crime at its most calculated. On the top of the chain sat Daniel Kelly. By 2019, Kelly was already regarded by detectives as a high-level criminal operator. His criminal history stretched across borders and continents. He had previously been involved in cocaine smuggling operations, attempting to import drugs from the Caribbean hidden inside tins of beans and coconut milk. He was also wanted in Japan over a violent jewellery robbery in Tokyo, where a security guard was assaulted during the raid. Extradition proceedings had been requested, but were put on hold due to his prosecution in the UK. Investigators believed Kelly was not simply involved in the plot to kill Paul Allen, he was directing it. At trial, the court heard that Kelly had conducted reconnaissance, helped organise the logistics of the attack, and ultimately pulled the trigger himself. Judge Sarah Whitehouse, KC, later described him as a dangerous offender and said she was satisfied Kelly was the gunman. His position in the criminal hierarchy was described as higher than that of his co-defendants, reflecting his leadership role. One of the most remarkable breakthroughs in the investigation came years later from an unlikely source. In 2024, a police officer searching the foreshore of the River Thames with a metal detector made an extraordinary discovery. An iPad mini buried just an inch beneath the sand near the O2 Arena. The device had been underwater for more than 5 years, caked in mud and corrosion, yet inside, the SIM card remained intact. Forensic experts painstakingly cleaned the device and recovered call data that proved crucial. The information linked Daniel Kelly and the Ahearne brothers to the shooting, placing them in contact before and after the attack. It also connected them to the Swiss museum heist. What had appeared to be a near-perfect crime unravelled because of a single piece of discarded technology. After years of silence, the truth finally spoke. In April 2025, almost 6 years after the shooting, the case reached its conclusion at the Old Bailey. Daniel Kelly, now 46, was sentenced to 36 years in prison with an additional 5-year extended licence due to the danger he was deemed to pose to the public. Louis Ahearne received a sentence of 33 years, while his brother Stewart was jailed for 30 years. Kelly was absent from court, citing severe back pain, but the judge made a position clear. His longer sentence reflected his senior role in the plot and her belief that he was the man who fired the shots. Judge Whitehouse told the court that while the precise motive for the attempted murder may never be fully understood, she was satisfied the men were driven by the promise of financial gain. She also made it clear others may have been involved behind the scenes, even if they never stood trial. Kelly's problems didn't end with sentencing. Shortly after arriving at Franklin Prison in County Durham, he was reportedly attacked by another inmate who attempted to slash his throat. He survived with only minor injuries, and the prison service later described the incident as minor. But a source close to the prison painted a darker picture, claiming Kelly was a dead man walking inside, describing him as a gunman willing to shoot from a distance, but vulnerable in close quarters. Today, Daniel Kelly faces decades behind bars in the UK, but his story's far from isolated. His name still appears on international wanted lists, including Japan, where authorities continue to seek his extradition once his British sentence is complete. From drug smuggling and high-value burglaries to one of the most chilling assassination plots in modern British crime, the case of Daniel Kelly exposes the hidden networks of organised crime operating beneath the surface of everyday life. For Paul Allen, the cost was irreversible. A man who once lived by violence would spend the rest of his life confined to a wheelchair. For Daniel Kelly, the shooting marked the beginning of the end, a crime so serious, so meticulously investigated that it finally dismantled everything he had built. In the shadowy world of organised crime, it was a reminder that no matter how carefully a plot is planned, the truth has a way of resurfacing.
Good afternoon or good evening when this video reaches you from Yami B TV. Hopefully I can come up with some comedy gold very shortly with you know who right now. Scorching outside. I was going to leave these videos until tomorrow, but I have to report on this case as it's a case that we've reported on Yami B TV before, and it does involve one of my old mates from way back in the day. So we talk Danny Kelly, the man who was convicted of being the shooter of Paul Allen, another man that I met along the way who's sadly now paralysed, right? Paul Allen, you remember, was a co-defendant to Lee Murray on one of the biggest robberies that took place in England, the £53 million depot heist, right? So they're reporting on social media, because Danny Kelly got 36 years for this case. He had two co-defendants, two brothers, and I think they've all fallen out, I'm not too sure. But Danny Kelly got 36 years, but he had it, which is a long sentence for a man who hasn't committed murder, but he did have some antique theft and robbery charges in other countries as well. I'm hearing he's still got to face more in Japan, so he's not really a happy man, Danny Kelly, right? So first place that he goes to, because it was only recent he got sentenced, is HMP Category A, Franklin, where it's reported, like I said, that he's had his throat cut in some way or another, right? Now, a lot of speculation going on, a hit, a botched hit, and whatnot. Look, I'm hearing, again, not facts, the weapon used is a homemade tool with razors that they've come behind him to try and cut his throat, right? Now, with these instruments, because if I'm suggesting that Danny, there wasn't no altercation with this geezer, it could be even mental health, who knows, right? But I doubt it. So there's been no fight or build up to anything, right? He hasn't gone with a shank metal thing as in to stab him and all that. He's come from behind to cut Danny Kelly's throat. So there's only a couple of things that could have happened here. When he's gone like that to cut his throat, the tool's broke and it's not a really good homemade one. The other thing is that sometimes you get comedian hitmen, like I was a little bit, right, who go in half-hearted to do the job. We're not conclusively saying this is a hit. It could have been some mix-up on the landing, like I said to you. But they do report in this article that, well, it's funny how Danny Kelly can't really have a row and all that, so now he ain't got the gun and he's a bad man on the streets with a weapon. No, Danny Kelly can have a row with his hands, and there's factual evidence to go with this. And I used to play fight with these guys way back in the day, right? Especially Danny Kelly and Conan. Yeah, I met Fabian as well way back. Fabian was a good geezer. All part of the growing up team with Lee Murray and all that. I met Mark Epstein, I think, once or something. That's how I got to know Conan. But no, Danny Kelly can use his hands. The only thing that I can think of this, and this again isn't fact, you know, I'm just going from what I've heard briefly and what they're suggesting, is that Danny Kelly must have disarmed him. He must have crept up. You know, sometimes you get any old hitman in prison where you can just pay quickly to go and do the job. And if you're not fully into it and you're not really skilled at it, and even if you are skilled, sometimes things can go wrong with these homemade weapons, mate. But my bit is, this is what I believe, right, is that Danny Kelly, when he's gone like that, has disarmed him. Danny Kelly obviously wasn't prepared for this, and I like I said before, I don't believe there was an altercation between these two guys, but at the end of the day, we're not there to see it. So I don't know whether some of you have heard this, but you know, it's a kind of liked a few of them when I was younger, but I'm just glad he's come out of that one okay. But the speculation that it might be a hit from the out or it could be a hit from bloody everywhere. But I'll be honest on this occasion, I do stick my neck on the line, and I believe it's a hit, whether it's from inside or whether it's from outside or wherever. But this has all the hallmarks of being somebody being paid. It could be for some prison stuff and all that. Danny Kelly, when I was with him when he was a kid, he used to have little spats on the landings with people, and not a man who really backs down. Danny Kelly, not really scared of anyone. But none of this, apart from he definitely nearly had his throat cut severely, is facts, all right? So I'm going to come up here in a minute and do this comedy gold for you.
Mr. Louis Ahearne and Mr. Stewart Ahearne, you can remain seated for the moment. The victim surcharge will apply in this case to each of these defendants, and I direct that the order be drawn up in the appropriate amount after the hearing. Daniel Kelly is not present in court today. I accept that he wished to be present, but he is prevented from attending by severe back pain. His counsel, Miss Jones, has confirmed that instructions have been taken from him, and she's content that I proceed to sentence him in his absence. And so that is what I will do. On Monday, the 24th of March of 2025, Daniel Kelly, Louis Ahearne and Stewart Ahearne were all found guilty of conspiracy to murder Paul Allen. The verdicts were unanimous decisions by the jury. On the 11th of July of 2019, at just after 11 o'clock at night, a number of shots were fired through the ground floor windows at the back of Paul Allen's home. Mr. Allen was hit by 2 of the bullets. He survived the shooting, but he suffered life-changing injuries. 1 bullet caused wounds to the thumb and little finger on his left hand. Another bullet entered on a downwards trajectory at the front of his neck and lodged in his spinal cord, leaving him paralysed for life. Daniel Kelly and Louis Ahearne were there at the back of Paul Allen's house that night. I'm satisfied that Stewart Ahearne was not present that night. You, Louis Ahearne, were the only defendant to give evidence at the trial. You accepted that you were there at the back of Paul Allen's house, but you said that you had no idea that a shooting was planned. You said you thought that you and Daniel Kelly were carrying out a reconnaissance for a burglary. The jury rejected that account. Neither Daniel Kelly nor Stewart Ahearne gave evidence. The case put forward on behalf of each of them was that he was not present at the scene of the shooting and he wasn't part of any agreement to murder Paul Allen. Paul Allen lived with his partner, Jade Bovingdon, and their 2 very young children. Mr. Allen was convicted in 2006 for taking part in an armed robbery and was sentenced to 18 years imprisonment. Whether the motive for this shooting was connected with that is something we do not and may never know. The 3 defendants in this case worked together to carry out burglaries. On the 1st of June of 2019, they burgled a museum in Geneva and managed to steal 3 items, including a Ming vase with a combined value of more than £3 million. Louis Ahearne's evidence at this trial was that he became involved in this in order to pay back a large debt that he owed to Mr. Kelly. I have read the full judgment of the Swiss court, and I heard Louis Ahearne's account. And I'm satisfied that Mr. Kelly recruited the Ahearne brothers to that enterprise. On the 27th of June of 2019, there was a reconnaissance expedition to the area where Paul Allen lived. A Mercedes with a registration number starting LL66 was used for that expedition. Daniel Kelly was the only person insured to drive that car, and it was he who paid for the insurance. I'm satisfied that Mr. Kelly was in the car on that day. I can't be sure that Louis Ahearne and Stewart Ahearne were with him. On the night of the 7th of July of 2019, there was another reconnaissance expedition. Daniel Kelly's telephone was activating cells in the vicinity of Paul Allen's address at 11 o'clock until just after midnight. His telephone SIM card was also switched between his telephone handset and an iPad in the course of that night. The iPad was used in the planning and carrying out of the shooting. Once again, I cannot be sure that either of the Ahearne brothers was present on that night. On the 9th of July of 2019, Stewart Ahearne hired a Renault Captur from Avis in Dartford. He hired it in his own name and presented his own driving licence. The Renault was later to be used in the shooting of Paul Allen. However, on that night, the 9th of July, the 3 of you went in the Renault Captur with a 4th man to a gated community in Kent. You were disguised as police officers with a flashing light attached to the car. You burgled one apartment and attempted to burgle another. On the next morning, the 10th of July of 2019, a telephone number ending 7391 made its first appearance. This was a number used for making the arrangements for and carrying out the shooting. Its first activity was a text to you, Stewart Ahearne, at 9:23 that morning. The text read, "Yo, Mackerel, call on this." Over the 3 days that this 7391 phone number was in use, it was only ever in contact with 7 numbers. The most frequent contact was with Stewart Ahearne's number 9636. The second highest contact number was one attributed to Daniel Kelly's partner. One of the other 5 numbers it was in contact with was Louis Ahearne's partner. Another of the contacts from that telephone was a man called Sean Skinner, who is currently serving a lengthy sentence for drug and firearms offences. That is one of the indications of Daniel Kelly's associates. Later that afternoon, on the 10th of July, the Renault captor trailed a Mercedes, registration AF18, which was owned by Paul Allen and Jade Bovingdon, his partner. Miss Bovingdon was driving it that day. I'm satisfied that one or more of you or your associates placed a tracker under that Mercedes at some stage, since it would otherwise have been impossible to find the car and to track it on that afternoon. The evidence showed that Daniel Kelly had obtained several trackers. Louis Ahearne accepted in his evidence that he was in the Renault captor that afternoon and said that he was with his brother Stuart, who was driving, and with Daniel Kelly. Louis Ahearne said that he thought they were going back to Kent in connection with another burglary. The Renault captor was due to be returned to the car hire company the next day, the 11th of July, but the company simply extended the rental by 1 day and notified Stewart Ahearne by text message that they had done so. And so we come to the 11th of July, the day of the shooting of Paul Allen. And on that morning, the same Mercedes as had been used in the 27th of June reconnaissance trip was again driven from the Woolwich area, this time at about 5:30 in the morning, to the area of Paul Allen's home address in the north. The iPad, which had been used late on the night of the 7th of July with Daniel Kelly's SIM card inside it, was also being used. That car returned to the Woolwich area at about 7:15 that morning. In the evening, Daniel Kelly and Louis Ahearne went in the Renault captor to Paul Allen's home address. Louis Ahearne's account was that he thought they were going to carry out another burglary. He told the jury that they stopped on the way and he bought plastic gloves and tape at Daniel Kelly's request. They also stole registration plates from a van and put them onto the Renault. Paul Allen was not present at home when Daniel Kelly and Louis Ahearne first arrived in the area, but he returned home later. It was while he was in his kitchen about 11 o'clock that night that shots were fired from the back of his garden and into his house. The firearm was never recovered, but the expert evidence was that a Glock pistol was used in the shooting. I'm satisfied that the shots were fired by Daniel Kelly. He could be seen on the CCTV footage that night, just before the shooting, putting on a pair of gloves, and, in addition, an accessory, a modular optical sight, which can be used on a Glock pistol to improve accuracy, was later found at his home address. At least 6 bullets were fired, and 2 of them struck Mr. Allen. On the way back to the Woolwich area after the shooting, Daniel Kelly threw the iPad that had been used in connection with the shooting into the River Thames. Remarkably, it was found in a search by police divers in November of 2024, and data was recovered from it. The Mercedes LL66 that had been used in the reconnaissance expeditions was sold in Peterborough on the 15th of July of 2019 in part exchange for an Audi. Daniel Kelly and his partner, together with a man called Mbaki Nkwa, were present. And on the 15th of August of 2019, the Audi was stopped by the police for an unrelated reason. Daniel Kelly and Louis Ahearne were in the car with 2 others, and 2 tracking devices were found. Stewart Ahearne was arrested and then interviewed on the 30th of October of 2019. Louis Ahearne was arrested in December of 2019 and Daniel Kelly in January of 2020. The reason for the delay in bringing the case to trial was that Louis Ahearne and Stewart Ahearne were extradited to Switzerland, where they stood trial for the burglary of the museum in Geneva. They were convicted and sentenced to terms of imprisonment. Stewart and Louis Ahearne returned to the United Kingdom in March and June 2024 respectively, and were charged with the matter for which they fall to be sentenced today. Daniel Kelly did not return to Switzerland for trial with them, and I'm told the reason was that there is a competing extradition request in relation to an alleged robbery in Japan in relation to Daniel Kelly. Both of those extradition requests, as I understand it, from Switzerland and Japan remain outstanding. There are no victim impact statements before the court, but Paul Allen's injuries were severe. One bullet caused wounds to the thumb and little finger of his left hand. Another bullet entered on a downwards trajectory at the front of Mr. Allen's neck and lodged in his spinal cord, leaving him permanently paraplegic. That is, he has lost movement and feeling to the majority of the trunk of his body and all of his legs. Injuries of this type remain life-threatening because they carry additional medical and physiological consequences, including loss of normal regulation of blood pressure, which can rise suddenly and precipitously to dangerous levels. Paul Allen will be dependent on others for all of his needs for the rest of his life. I now turn to the role and the culpability of each one of you. You all denied participating in any conspiracy at all, but that does not prevent me from forming a view as to the respective roles of each of you. In the course of the trial, I have become familiar with the many and intricate pieces of evidence, and I had the benefit of hearing Louis Ahearne's account. I've been able to come to a clear and sure conclusion as to the role played by each of you and to your individual culpability. My conclusions are as follows. The underlying motive for the shooting, on the part of those who instigated it, remains unknown. I have no doubt that this agreement to murder Paul Allen involved other people, apart from the three of you, and that you three were motivated by a promise of financial gain. I am satisfied that Daniel Kelly, while not the instigator, was higher up in the organisational chain than Louis Ahearne or Stewart Ahearne. It was Daniel Kelly who recruited Louis Ahearne and Stewart Ahearne. Daniel Kelly went to some lengths to avoid detection and to conceal his own involvement. Daniel Kelly carried out the reconnaissance trips and arranged for a tracker or trackers to be placed on Paul Allen's Mercedes. While no tracker was found after the car was seized, that the car could not have been found and followed on the afternoon of the 10th of July if it had not been tracked. I'm also satisfied that it was Daniel Kelly who fired the shots through the Allen family windows. Louis Ahearne was the getaway driver and was present as a backup. He also, by his own admission, bought gloves and tape and assisted in placing stolen registration plates on the Renault Captur on the night of the shooting. He was also present when the Allen household Mercedes was followed on the 10th of July. Stewart Ahearne's principal role was to hire the Renault Captur, which was to be used by those carrying out the shooting, and he otherwise provided logistical support. He hired the car in his own name, using his own details. He also retained the mobile phone he used at the time. This indicates a lack of sophistication on his part. He too was present when the Allen household Mercedes was followed on the 10th of July. I turn then to the defendants and their antecedents. Daniel Kelly was born on the 26th of October of 1978 and is now 46 years of age. Mr. Kelly has 20 convictions for 60 offences. These started with shoplifting at the age of 11, and at the age of 12 he was fined for carrying an air weapon and a bladed article in a public place. At the age of 15, Mr. Kelly was convicted of 3 offences of robbery and for carrying a firearm with intent to commit an indictable offence. At the age of 20, he received a sentence of 45 months imprisonment for being concerned in the supply of Class A drugs. Other offences include several for dwelling house burglaries, and in 2004, an aggravated burglary and kidnapping. The most recent was a conviction for the importation of Class A drugs, for which Mr. Kelly was sentenced to 6 years' imprisonment on the 12th of January of 2022 in the Crown Court sitting at Snaresbrook. There are currently extradition requests from Switzerland and from Japan in relation to other alleged offences.